Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. As Tia and Ronnie said, welcome to this last session of this year's EQAF in this special online edition. I hope that you're not too tired after this two-day program and that you're looking forward to this session as much as I am, actually. So, our today's session will explore different ways in which quality assurance actually shapes change in time and what is the relationship between QA, change, and time. For this reason, this session might be a little bit more theoretical or philosophical in nature, which incidentally is also my study background, but we will also try to explore implications and practical issues. We will do so in a format of discussion between myself and our two speakers. But before the introduction, just a couple of notes on technicalities, which you have certainly already heard about if you have attended previous sessions, but just in case. So this session will be recorded and it will be available later on the EUA YouTube channel. So you can just search there in YouTube, European University Association, and with the title of this session, you will be able to find it. You can then obviously use it as a reminder for this session, but you can also use it to disseminate it further, to maybe share with your colleagues who for any reason might not have been able to attend. You will also, if you have registered for the session, receive a link to the recording. Now, as with all of our sessions in this year's EQAF, you will be able to interact through the chat, where you should address also any technical questions, and you also have a Q&A tab where you can ask for questions, you can vote for questions, so everything is basically the same as in all the other sessions. And now I would introduce our speakers in this session. We have two of them. Mr. Anthony McLaren is the second Vice Chancellor of St. Mary's University. In his career, he has held a number of posts, including that of the CEO of the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, TEQSA, in Australia, and that of the Chief Executive of the UK's Quality Assurance Agency, QAA. Anthony has also served as a member of different types of boards of QA agencies and associations, including EQAF, and CAGEA in the United States. Our second speaker, Mr. Oliver Vettori, is the Dean of Accreditation and Quality Management and Director of Program Management and Teaching and Learning Affairs at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. Oliver has been working in higher education management and research for more than 15 years as a reviewer, trainer, researcher, and expert, working with various agencies and higher education institutions in about 50 different countries on 4 different continents. So as you can see, we have speakers today with very, very rich experience. And yes, as I said, I think it will be a very interesting session for the end of this year's EQAF. Oliver and Anthony, I hope that you can hear me and that everything works fine. Anthony, yes. We just cannot see your video. Anthony, could you try saying something to check if we can at least hear you? Okay, there seems to be an issue here. Okay, but yeah, it seems, as Tia said, this Friday the 13th is really impacting our technical side of things. But we will still start the session with a question for Oliver. So the first question, and this is since you are especially interested in this, is what is this relationship between time and quality assurance, and how are, in brief, temporal aspects influencing the practice of quality assurance?
Okay, thank you, Alexander. Well, first of all, hi to everyone, especially all those friends and colleagues I cannot see in person this time. And I really hope that Anthony will make it. Oh, yes, there he is. Otherwise, I could have started contradicting myself, Anthony, but it's easier with you on board. Yeah, Anthony, thank you for the question about quality assurance and time. This is actually a rather recent research interest of mine. And to answer it very briefly, I mean, there's some obvious relations. As every part of our social life, of course, also quality assurance is bound to time. I mean, we as people are existing in time. We couldn't exist without time. And there's some obvious relationships as for any social phenomenon. But what I'm interested in is actually how quality assurance is organizing time. And if you take a close look at it, it very much, in many aspects, sets the rhythm and the pace for our organizations. And the argument I was also making in the video we uploaded is I'm not sure how many of that is deliberately reflected. So if you take a look at the language and quality assurance, you find lots of expressions like cyclical, continuous, regularly. You find all those temporal aspects, like a review has to be done every 3 years, every 5 years, every 7 years. You have annual quality management cycles. Now the question is, how much do we actually reflect how our use of time impacts not only the organizations, but also how we understand quality and improvement. It makes a big difference if you give an institution 7 years to come up with an improvement, or you give it 3 years. But the interesting thing is, if you take a look at different agencies and approaches, very often it seems bound to logistics and resources. How much can you actually allow institutions? How often is it actually possible for them to get to the cycles? But for the institution itself, it really organizes the way they approach it, and it organizes the time. And I think that's something that I feel deserves a bit more attention. To round that up, I often have the feeling we discuss a lot about improvement, but from a political point of perspective, an improvement very much is what an observer, speak a quality reviewer, sees as sufficient progress in re-evaluation after a follow-up visit. And that is not necessarily in line with what the institution has done meaningfully or was able to meaningfully do in the meantime.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. There is just one thing that we would mention. We do seem to have some sound interference on your side. I don't. Okay, now it's better actually. And yeah, and so sound was a little bit off when you were speaking. But now at least the background, the interference seems to have been removed. So thank you for the answer, Oliver. And the next question will go to Anthony, and it's actually very much related to what you were saying, Oliver, about this pace of change. In what time frame do we then expect this change to happen? And my question to Anthony would be, if we know that external demands that are being placed on higher education are changing and developing ever more rapidly. Now, this is, I think, the crucial external development. These expectations change more and more rapidly. And on the other hand, we know that producing deep change requires a lot of time and effort, usually at least. So do you think that there is a risk that quality assurance start to increasingly lag behind external changes? And if yes, can we do anything to counter this risk?
Thank you, Alexander. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Good. Okay. And apologies for the delay in the video at the beginning. Hello, everybody. It's very good to be with this discussion. I think that there is certainly a risk of the tension between quality assurance and development, particularly at times of rapid development, which you could argue that we're going through at the moment. But I would say, in defense of quality assurance, that it is a tension and a contradiction of which quality assurance is well aware. And I do believe that quality assurance agencies and systems try to take it into account. If I give the example of my own agency, which I led until recently in Australia, in the legislation which established TEXA as the national regulator and quality assurance agency, the legislation actually specifies that one of the objectives of TEXA was to support innovation. Now, I have to say that whenever we had a strategic discussion within the agency, we always found that the most challenging part of our remit. We worked out where we were in terms of objectives around protecting students, around determining minimum standards, etc. But were we as an agency helping with innovation? I think it's a genuinely difficult question for quality assurance agencies. I think the responses tend to move between two poles. And at one pole, you have regulation, where the preoccupation is with ensuring that certain minimum standards of quality have been met and that providers are reliably delivering those standards to their students. And then at the other pole, you have the notion which goes almost beyond quality assurance to quality enhancement. And it's a model that in particular has always been very prominent in Scotland, where the objective of the quality assurance regime is actually to enhance quality, not simply to check that it's present, but to improve it. In practice and in my experience, most agencies move between those two poles, and at various times, depending on external pressures, on politics, on funding issues, agencies will adopt a position either closer towards regulation or quality towards or further towards quality enhancement. If I was going to generalize, I would say that quality assurance and quality enhancement probably comes to the fore and works most effectively in relatively stable, mature higher education systems. At times of rapid change, or at times where there is a great deal of sector entry of new providers, the preoccupation tends to go more towards the regulatory end of that spectrum, because the concern there is ensuring that at least minimum standards are being delivered to students. So it is absolutely a tension. I think it's built in the issues that are faced by quality assurance agencies and policymakers. But I do think that agencies and policymakers are aware of these tensions, and depending on their priorities, try to structure things to best accommodate that tension.
Thank you for that. And to go back to Oliver, do you believe then if we, I mean, today's the name of today's session is QA shaping change, and even if we focus on this enhancement dimension of quality assurance in an ideal scenario, would you say, Oliver, that the quality assurance is still more on the reactive than proactive side? Or is it a good, or is it like a good recipe, a good way to alleviate the problem, to just work more, basically work more on the enhancement dimension of quality assurance?
That's a very good question. Starting from Anthony's tension, I think the relationship is a bit more complicated than that between quality assurance and change, Alexander. So what I do believe that most of the methodology, and I know you want to explore that a bit later, but most of the methods and instruments we're using are actually better at documenting change and really bringing change up, creating innovation, creating something within the organization. But what I see is that a lot of quality reviews are actually kind of importing change to institutions. So I've been working as a quality reviewer all across the globe for more than 10 years now. But also, if you take a look at the research, you see, sorry, there's the noise again. It should be at my end.
Yes, I don't know, Oliver, if you maybe have headphones with you, using that might help.
Sorry, if I?
Yeah, I was just saying, okay, now the noise has been removed again, but I was saying if you maybe have headphones with you, maybe using that would help.
I can try that in a minute. Try if the noise returns like this. Coming back to the point. So what I see is that a lot of quality reviewers carry ideas from some place to another, and that's instilling change in organizations. So it's bringing elements from somewhere else, trying to bring change. There's a lot of models that you bring forward, and it creates something new in institutions. The point I would argue is, though, it's kind of creating a new status quo, because the innovation happened somewhere else. So import it to a new institution, you bring them all to the same level, even if you have a rather, or especially if you have a rather stable reviewer pool. And that means what I'm saying, it can instill change, it does bring forward change, but most methods are not really good at creating something new from itself, from within the institution, I'm afraid. And
Yes,
while we
thank
move on to Anthony, I'll try to fetch my headphones and see if that works better.
That's great. Thank you. Yes, Anthony, to go back to you, would you add anything to your previous response in light of what Oliver just shared with us?
Well, I think I would want to add the fact that I do think that to go beyond the polarities that I was describing, I do think that quite naturally, from the exercise of the function of external quality assurance, I think it's. I'm now hearing an echo back. Sorry, I've just. I'll try and keep going. I think that it's a very natural extension of quality assurance of individual institutions, individual universities and colleges, that the external quality assurance agency starts to build up a picture of good practice, of where things are being done relatively well, where things are being done relatively poorly, things to avoid, things to emulate. And sometimes that will include innovation, although innovation of its nature may be harder to capture. So again, depending on the expectations around the external quality assurance function, I think it's quite natural for agencies to begin to, as indeed they do, to publish guidance on where the good practice is. Now, you could argue that that then tends towards a new uniformity, because other providers will then tend to emulate that good practice, and you're in danger of actually stifling the diversity that you may be trying to encourage. But nevertheless, I do think it's an important function. If I give a case study from my experience at TEXA, TEXA back in, long before I joined it, but back in 2014, was actually explicitly instructed to focus only on the reviews of individual providers and to cease its work on sector-wide issues. By the time I arrived in 2015, that was already beginning to be perceived generally as problematic, because, of course, sector-wide issues do exist. There is good practice, there is poor practice, and often an external agency is best placed to give an overview of where the good practice and the things to be avoided are taking place. And we found, during my 5 years there, we found increasingly that we as an agency were being turned to and explicitly asked to re-engage with sector-wide issues. And those were very varied. It might have been the quality of English language qualifications for international students. It might have been the social problem of sexual harassment and assault on university campuses. It might have been the issue of freedom of speech, which was a very current issue within the higher education sector during the time I was there. But so increasingly, we were asked, despite the fact that originally the agency had been asked to stay away from sector-wide issues, we got involved in sector-wide issues. So that policy function, the identification of good practice, and then the dissemination of that good practice by an agency, I personally believe is a very important part of the function. And I think when it's neglected, I think that is an omission. Whether that can always capture innovation, I think that's more difficult. But I think it certainly in some cases will capture innovation. And a piece of work that we did in partnership with other countries within the Asia Pacific region on online learning was a good example of agencies working together to identify the best practice and the innovation, and then try to ensure that that was made available across the whole region.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And yes, as you said, if you focus on examples of good practice, maybe in light of our previous discussion, we can also say they're not just something to be copied from others, but they can just be a stimulus for more reflective thinking, and in this way, maybe bring about innovation. But my next question for both of you would be, I mean, if you look at the current state of affairs to the real world, there is a certain stigma that quality assurance stifles change, flexibility, and innovation, and that it basically codifies current patterns. So what would you say is the cause of this? Is this a misperception? Is it based on on maybe some realistic tendencies which are then elevated. We also actually have a question similar to that by one of our participants asking, do you think that the assumption that quality assurance is a barrier to innovation is more a perception from institution than it is embedded in QA approaches? So if you could maybe reflect on that, Oliver, we'll go back to you first.
Okay, thank you, Alexander. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Without interferences? Okay, sorry everyone for the bad sound. It did work in the rehearsal, but that's one of the interesting things we are now experiencing through all our virtual encounters. Well, coming back to Alexander, I always feel part of the misconception is that we expect quality assurance to bring forward change. And I mean, coming back to what Anthony was talking about with regard to enhancement, inherently there is an assumption that this enhancement is also about change and it's about creativity and innovation, but a lot of the quality assurance discourse, a lot of the reasons why it was shared was about creating common standards, ensuring minimum standards. So it was about creating stability. And I feel that a lot of when we're now arguing it should bring forward innovation may be a big part, and that's part of the problem. That was not part of the perception or the expectations at the beginning. Now, those who have heard me talk, and I'm sorry for things that I've already talked about years ago, but I've always made a clear distinction between quality assurance as a more politically infused discourse, which is very much about ensuring stakeholder satisfaction, minimum standards. It's very much a political concept. And quality management, which is about kind of supporting institutional strategies, strategy development, implementing strategy, bringing those things forward. Now, both of them, as I've always argued, require completely different instruments and methods. And if you just take satisfaction surveys in order to move forward strategy building and strategy development and trying to assess where you are, that's not going to help improve institutions. That's not going to help to bring the institution forward with regard to re-innovating its processes or structures. But on the other hand, the instruments you have there are not necessarily adequate to actually ensure policymakers or society at large that the institution is doing well. So I think part of the problem is that we very often confuse those two different logics, and that we need to keep them separate and try different methodologies and different approaches if we really want to go to our institutional development. That might also mean moving away from surveys and standardized questionnaires more into workshop methods. Yeah, I always think that QA professionals would need or would benefit from bit better moderators and designing workshops instead of just designing questionnaires. Yeah, as I said, separated from the other part of the discourse.
Yes, as I think it was one of the previous sessions today where we heard about this, that QA methods should be more qualitative.
Agree.
Yeah. And okay, back to you, Anthony, about your perception on the cause of this stigma, basically.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I think Oliver's made some extremely important points there, and many of them I would agree with. And I think we have to remember there are distinct and different purposes for that spectrum of activity, from regulation through to quality enhancement, and they're not identical, and sometimes they're in conflict. So I would certainly agree with that. I suppose I've been on both sides of the quality fence, both as a regulator and now inside a university, and I do see it from both sides, I think. I think, first of all, there is a legitimate argument that in some areas of development, and perhaps in the most exciting areas of innovation, the very best thing that agencies can do and regulators is to stand back from them. We had a couple of years ago, an excellent conference on the quality assurance of micro-credentials. And I remember a colleague from New Zealand, New Zealand had gone through the process of trying to work out how micro-credentials might be accommodated in the national qualifications framework. And he argued, I think quite persuasively, that that in fact bringing them within the national qualifications framework would be the worst possible thing you could do. What was the right approach was to allow the innovation and the diversity to flourish, and to allow the qualifications and the students to find each other in a way which didn't attempt immediately to corral them within a qualifications framework. So I do understand that argument, and I think it's one that agencies must be very aware of. However, let me just say this perhaps somewhat more provocatively to colleagues who are working within universities. In my time working in quality assurance agencies, I think it's true to say that it's quite rare that higher education providers actively welcome external quality assurance. I think they've come to terms with it. Those of us who've been involved in this area for a while will remember the days when any form of external scrutiny was vigorously resisted by universities. I think they've come to terms with it, but I think it's still the case that they sometimes don't find it welcome, sometimes don't find it comfortable, and there is a resentment. And therefore, they will use arguments which appear to discredit external quality assurance as an activity. And I do think that happens. And if you like, that happens in the politics of higher education rather than the philosophy of higher education. But it certainly does happen. In other cases, the presentation of the external quality assurance agency as a restrictive, inhibiting force which is resisting innovation, I've certainly witnessed that perception being used within higher education providers to try to resolve internal battles between different parts of the university. So someone will want to do something and another part of the university won't want to do it. And the part of the university that doesn't want to do it will say, oh, no, we can't do that because QAA wouldn't approve, or TEXA wouldn't approve, or whoever it might be. Actually, QAA or TEXA don't have that view at all, but they're quoted and they're presented as being this rather restrictive force to resolve internal battles. I think that when I certainly recall at QAA, we used to talk about the tendency of institutions also to gold plate their quality assurance arrangements and then say that they were burdensome. Well, the reason they were burdensome is that providers were doing far more than they actually needed to do to satisfy the demands of external quality assurance. So that gold plating tendency, I think, can also lead to this perception of the burden presented by quality assurance. And then the final point, Alexander, that I'd want to make in this part of the discussion is to recognize that there is a genuine technical challenge to agencies to find indicators that are perhaps indicative of future problems rather than the past. So many, particularly actually as one moves towards quality assurance or regulation through published statistical indicators, many of those indicators are of their essence retrospective rather than looking forward. And that means that almost structurally, the external quality assurance is destined almost to always be lagging behind. And certainly in my discussions with fellow colleagues within quality assurance agencies, we were often looking to identify what might be called leading indicators, indicators that were an indicator of trouble to come, rather than simply reporting on something that happened in the past and may already have been resolved.
Yes, thank you. And just to follow up on that a little bit, since, as you said, you have experiences from various sides of the quality assurance. And it was interesting, I think this last thing especially that you mentioned, if you look at this kind of, let's say, division into more traditional quality assurance approaches or more like this data-focused, outcomes-driven approach, which might even be called regulatory. So you basically look at the outcomes and the success and not to what degree and in which way an institution or part of an institution is basically trying to do something. So this would be these two different approaches. From what you've been saying, it would seem to me that it would imply that this first approach that I mentioned, this more like outcomes-driven approach, would be more restrictive in a sense of stimulating change and innovation, precisely, or at least because of the difficulty in setting up indicators for the future. Would you agree with this assessment? Do you think this is correct, and or can this maybe somehow be countered and we can still find a place for this approach?
It's a very, very interesting point, which I've given quite a lot of thought to. I mean, the two major systems that I worked within, first the UK system and then the Australian system, the method of external quality assurance and regulation was really quite different. So I would characterize at the time, things have moved on, but I would characterize at the time the Quality Assurance Agency in the UK adopting an approach which was recognizably similar to that more traditional approach that you've described. Cyclical review, I think in the case of QAA every 5 years for providers. And then I found myself in an Australian system, which is very, very different. No reviews at all. Annual risk assessment of every provider. There were 170 providers in the system, and every single provider was annually risk assessed against 12 risk indicators. Those risk indicators were statistical and numerical or financial. So they were all published figures, or figures that were made available by the provider. I think that the latter, that sort of data-focused, outcomes-driven kind of regulatory approach suits very well a system where the focus is on the achievement of a minimum threshold, a threshold standard of quality delivery. Arguably, and it's very interesting that TEXA over the last year itself conducted a sector-wide review, because arguably where that system struggles a little bit more is to accommodate those institutions that are genuinely taking risks in the good sense of the word. I mean, innovation depends on risk taking, and therefore a risk-based approach to regulation has the danger of stigmatizing risk as a bad thing. Well, sometimes it is, of course, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's essential in order for progress to be made. And I think that those very outcome data-driven systems struggle more. Whereas actually, funnily enough, the more traditional review, dialogue, extensive conversations with maybe, over 100 of individuals within a university, etc. In that process of dialogue, you can get a closer sense of whether the institution is managing risk effectively and indeed harnessing risk for innovation, or whether they are genuinely risky in the bad sense of the word, in that they're likely to fail their students or collapse financially, or those kinds of risks.
Yes, thank you. That is very interesting. I remember that I think at the last year's EQAF, we also heard from one of the speakers an argument that we are more and more becoming extremely risk-averse societies, and their higher education is more and more risk-averse to the point where it's becoming detrimental. So I think that's also a very interesting point. Oliver, to go back to you, and yeah, just a small note to both of you. We are a little bit running out of time, so please just try to keep your answers concise. So Oliver, to just delve a little bit more deeply into what you said previously about the methods, and it seems to be a thread that runs through many different discussions, that we need to, let's say, have this more qualitative approach to quality assurance. Would you have some practical advice for those who would like to move towards these more qualitative methods, perhaps at their institutions, to talk about internal QA? Because we also, for example, have an interesting comment from one of our participants that qualitative methods offer more details, sure, but they are more culturally influenced. And that's just one of the examples of difficulties. There are many others. So would you have some practical guidance?
All right, thank you, Alexander. Two comments, actually. One of them I would like to link to what Anthony and you have just discussed, also on the more outcome-oriented. I do agree. I think that's a trend we see, the whole quantification. It's a big trend going through all parts of our society, and it's also part of QA now. But there are approaches, and now linking it to the topic of the session, there are approaches out there that try to assess an institution's capacity for change. Now, do I believe we can do that through the quantitative outcome indicators? No. But on the other hand, it's also not enough to just ask, do you have processes in place? Do you have processes where you regularly ask stakeholders, where you regularly hold meetings? What I feel very often is linking is the intermediary between those two logics. So actually tracing what all those processes actually bring about. I've hardly ever seen an approach where also reviewers were asking, show us 3 examples of improvements and where they were originating from. Did they actually come from any kind of survey? Did they come from any kind, or were they basically, in the heads of management people anyway? Were they externally imposed? Where did they come from the QA system, or where did they originate from? And I do believe that that would help. And that's actually what I also believe is a qualitative methodology. So what we should not do is it's not just about workshops and interviews instead of questionnaires. A qualitative methodology is about tracing also chains of cause and effects, trying to reconstruct decisions, trying to reconstruct processes, try to understand what has happened and when, and through this establish if an institution is actually really living by the principles or the goals it does. So of course it can be anecdotal, and it can be just examples, but I think that's then up to the reviewer or the check, making sure that it's not just about a few examples that people provide. This is the great example. You pick those. You choose an example that is going very well, but you don't leave it to the institution itself to choose the best practice examples, because most of us know that all the other faculties or departments have just not followed up on that. So that would be my first remark. And just going to the second, because there's also the question. Yes, I think, but there's nothing wrong with having something that is a bit more, vulnerable to cultural influences. QA in its essence is inherently a political concept. We're always talking about stakeholders, and it is about stakeholder negotiation. So there is nothing wrong with people trying to influence processes and bring that into the methodology. We just need some safeguards. We need some mechanisms to make sure that there's not one or two power players try to jeopardize the whole process and owning it themselves. And giving you a short practical example, because we're asking for it, Alexander, we have developed for our own program evaluations at my institution, we have developed an approach that is very much a negotiated reality approach. So we have moved away from the traditional format that you have a self-assessment report for an academic program, and then you have a couple of peers and they come and assess the program and give their verdict. Instead of that, we're bringing different stakeholder groups together into one workshop. They are provided with all the numbers, with all the details. They discussed it for a day. They really negotiate the quality of the program. They negotiate where are the biggest problems from different perspectives. And ultimately, they come up with proposed actions on how to fix that. And that binds all those stakeholders to the decisions. So again, it's not people trying to come up with solutions to problems that others have found. It's actually the problems that the people owning the program have discovered, identified together with the different stakeholders of the program. And that's an inherently qualitative approach, but very much based on numbers and data that we feed into the process. So I think that, that would be an example, and I think it can work.
Okay, that's great, Oliver. Thank you. I'm sure that will be quite useful for stimulating both thinking and probably change of practices in the future. Maybe just to reflect to another comment that we have had in the chat, and it relates to this issue of different methodologies, but talking about external QA. So the comment says that quality enhancement approaches can help to ensure that institutions have the capacity to adapt and improve. So basically to change, but no matter what the actual change is. And that the external QA should not impose the nature of the change. So I think, at least I personally find that this comment sums up quite nicely. I mean, it's about building the capacity of an institution to change, but not imposing the direction of this change. That obviously opens some other issues, but I think that as I said, I think it does sum up nicely what I think we all agree is the aim. So I think that the time is now for taking some of the questions from our Q&A section. So yeah, and also here we do not have participants saying to whom the question is directly directed to, but maybe you can just see who would like to answer. So we'll start with the top voted answer, which says, given the spectrum of QA approaches described by the speakers, could I comment on one of the outcomes from a recent QQI study that demonstrated that the stronger the internal quality assurance system in an institution is, the better equipped the institution is to deal with an emergency or difficult situation? What should or could be the impact of that fact on external quality assurance approaches?
Happy to have a go at that, Alexander.
Sure.
So I think that's a very important point. And you know, one of the underlying principles of quality assurance is that of external quality assurance is that, you know, except in extreme cases, the external quality assurer is not there to impose quality assurance on the institution. It's there to confirm the internal quality assurance that always exists. So the starting point is always the internal quality assurance. And the strength of that, it seems to me not an unreasonable view to say that the stronger those internal approaches to quality assurance are, the likelier is going to be a strong response in relation to unexpected crises. We ought to actually emphasize, and I may have been partly responsible for this. I think Oliver very helpfully in his last answer showed that there doesn't need to be an opposition between data and evaluation. You know, data should be the gateway to evaluation, but data, you know, is important. It's important that we are evidence-based. Good internal quality assurance systems, I think, will bring those two things together.
Just two sentences, Alexander. I'm not familiar with the study as such, but I think the question is there a variable binding both of it? And I would argue what makes a good IQA system and what makes a good emergency management system is a very strong communication architecture in the back, our decision-making processes that support it. So if you have that kind of culture, if you have a very good structures and processes for effective communication, for binding in people, for organizing very quickly, for adapting very quickly, yeah, I think that's part, and it's very difficult for me to say it's like a hen or egg problem. Is that part of the IQA system? Or is that the foundation why the IQA system is at the end for successful in those institutions? For me, it's difficult to assess, but I do believe there is a connection and a causal connection. I would just take a step back and say it has a lot to do with the structures in the back of both of it.
Yes, indeed. So in a way that if it fosters adaptability, then naturally it will lead to such an outcome. So thank you for the answers. And yeah, I think we can take some more questions. So how would we in practice separate quality assurance, so accountability dimension, accountability-oriented quality assurance, and quality enhancement? And would this even be desirable for most quality assurance agencies?
That's that is a good question, and I think that in practice, most agencies are a mixture of accountability and enhancement. I mean, I think that, and that will vary even during the lifetime of a particular agency, and it will often vary, frankly, due to external pressures. And when I say external pressures, I don't mean necessarily illegitimate pressures. They're often responses to particular failures. So, you know, a particular failure in an area of institutional quality delivery will often prompt a shift in an agency's attention towards the more regulatory end of its activity. And, you know, regulation is I mean, it's about many things, but it's certainly about accountability. The regulatory relationship depends on the concept that the provider is accountable in some way to external forces, whether they be government, funders, students, etc. So conversely, there will be times when it's deemed to be more important that there be a focus on generally uplifting quality as a whole. I mean, regulatory threshold standard systems are very good at providing overall assurance. They're much less good at making distinctions between various levels of quality, because after all, for a high quality higher education system, we shouldn't aspire to simply be delivering the regulatory minimum. We should be aspiring to delivering the best level of quality that we can. So as far as I can see, it's going to be inevitable that for most agencies, they will have to find their position on that spectrum, but they will be doing a bit of both. In some cases, it'll be very clear what they're doing because there'll be a legal framework for it. In others, it's much more a relationship of consent.
Okay, thank you. Anything to add, Oliver?
Again, very briefly, Anthony always gives me time to think. I think we unfairly often treat this as complete opposites, accountability and enhancement, and I think it's not true. Yeah, it's very legitimate that institutions are accountable and the process need to be in place. Enhancement is a different logic. It has nothing to do with it. Now, where both of them get together, they're in competition when it comes, and now connected again to time. I mean, resources are finite. So within a system, when an agency is putting overdue stress, too much stress on the accountability part of it, that means the institution takes too much of its resources to actually cater to all these compliance issues. But the other question is, and even if an institution has enough time, it does not necessarily mean that all this extra time would flow into enhancement. So I think it's not always correct to put them into this kind of antagonistic position. Both of them require different approaches. Both of them require different kind of attention. And last but not least, what is an enhancement? And I'm completely in love with the Scottish approach, but mostly from an ideological point of view. What counts as an enhancement is very much an observer's point of view. And we've just done a major evaluation of our own distance education now with 8 different sub-projects evaluating everything. And what we realized in the end is what could be a major improvement from the perspective of teachers with regard to the next semesters is certainly not improvement from the perspective of students and vice versa. So how do you deal with that from an enhancement-led process? And that again means negotiating different stakeholder interests and making compromises.
Indeed, thank you. And I think that we can take one more question. Yeah, maybe I see here one, because I mentioned earlier that I think it is a very nice conclusion from one of our participants, that basically the influence of external QA should be about building capacity, helping build capacities of institutions, but not directing where we go. And then I mentioned that this then maybe is a nice way to put this thing that we want, but it also opens some other issues. And there is one comment here that's actually directly related to that. And it asks, how can we balance the risk of innovation and ability to fail? I would actually call this like a right to fail, right? With the expectations of our students and regulators. I mean, we have talked about a lot about regulators, but if you look at students, maybe we can also talk about stakeholders in general. There are certain expectations. And then if we are advocating, as we more or less did, that we should be more open to risk, that there should be this right to fail. How can we make peace between these expectations from different stakeholders, students as internal stakeholders, and this ideal?
Well, again, briefly, Alexander, I think by being more honest about failings, from my point of perspective, we fail far more often as people and as institutions than we are really successful. But most of our methodologies are looking for best practice examples, success stories, things that worked really well, things that we can advertise. So I think part of what would help would actually be more open, transparent, and honest about that. And also about rewarding that kind of honesty, because of course it's a problem. And also in quality assurance, once you lay out a weakness in a SWOT analysis, you can be about a 90% sure that the reviewers are going to return to that weakness and say, fix it. So if you don't approach that tactically, you're creating a problem for your own about that honesty. And I think that requires a different approach to that on a deeply philosophical level.
I would, that's a very important point about honesty, because of course, one of the challenges of conducting any kind of external review is trying to encourage honesty. And, you know, there can be risks. I can only say that from my experience in QA and regulatory roles, we were by and large not concerned by those providers that acknowledge problems, because the very acknowledgement of a problem showed a degree of self-awareness and understanding. And it was even better, of course, if they could also demonstrate that they had a clear plans to address the problem. What was genuinely concerning as a regulator would often be those providers who obviously had problems but had no awareness of the problem. You know, so and in fact, we're telling you that everything was absolutely fine. So that sort of fundamental honesty is important, but it's not without risks. More generally, I think who is going to say that we shouldn't be good risk-taking innovators? Everyone in principle wants to see innovation and development and risk-taking of an appropriate kind. I would just say that there is a word of caution. A university might appropriately, in the context of, say, a 5-year plan, take some risks, and as a result of those risks, innovate and develop the way it was doing things. The difficulty for students is that a student, that may be the only chance they get to do that particular module. You know, that may be the only chance they get to make progress towards achieving their degree. So I guess that any appetite for risk-taking just has to be tempered with that student view about, you know, this is their unique experience as a student going through higher education a single time. And in a sense, we don't have the opportunity, we shouldn't have the opportunity to take too many risks with their experience, you know. So listening very closely to the students, testing developments with the students, I think is a really important part of trying to balance that tension.
Indeed, these are all very important points, so thank you for that. And yes, as you mentioned, how it can sometimes be the only chance that the student has to take that model. I guess it also brings us back to the Oliver's point about this interrelation with time, and basically on the time frame on which change happens. For different stakeholders, the perception will be very different. So this brings us to the end of this session. Big thanks to the both of you for this interaction. I think this was a very informative, but mostly very stimulating for thinking going forward. And I think we can be happy if in the future we see changes which are in line with the thinking that both of you have presented to us. So thank you for your interesting contributions. And we will now go back to Tia for closing the event.
Thank you very much for Alexander, Anthony, and Oliver for the session that really was addressing crucial matters of roles and responsibilities of different quality assurance actors. And we do hope that this has inspired our audience to reflect on why and how we do things in quality assurance. And I think it is good to wrap up with this kind of thought after we have been discussing the changes in higher education and how we keep the quality assurance relevant, and what is the role of quality assurance, for instance, addressing the different flexible forms of higher education. So I think it was a good reminder for us that let's not rush to conclusions, but take our time to reflect on what we are doing and why. It's Friday afternoon. I take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers who were willing to do this online format of EQAF with us. I think the excellent speakers have shown us that The strength of EQAF is the same that it is normally. It is bottom-up approach, asking for people who work on these matters and reflect them in their daily life to come and talk about them and to share their experiences. I also thank the audience, especially those who have stayed with us for the whole 2 days. I really congratulate you for your strength and stamina. It's been lovely to have you here. We hope that we have, as a program committee, been able to give you a good replacement for the usual EQAF, where we get to shake hands and hug each other in these moments when it is not possible. We do hope, however, that we will be able to go back to the usual EQAF next year. And here we would like to give you a little bit of a flavor of what EQAF could have been like here in if we had been able to meet where we were originally meant to meet, or where we will hopefully be able to organize EQAF next year. If my colleagues can show us the video, that would be great. That was the flavor we wanted to give you, and we will be in touch and hope to see you all soon. Before final goodbyes, I'll just thank still my colleagues at EUA who've worked behind the scenes very hard this autumn, so to make all these sessions happen. So great thanks to them, to our team, because this does take some work to be done. And that's about it. Hope to see you soon somewhere in one of our events or in someone else's events, in meetings, online, in person, wherever. In the meantime, I hope that you all stay safe and take care of you. And have a nice weekend.